today we're very privileged to have Professor Mack from the University of Washington speak to us on obscured by nation Japanese literature in Brazil. Professor Mack earned his BA in history from the University of Texas, Austin, his MA in modern Japanese literature at Columbia University, and his PhD in modern Japanese from Harvard. We communicated with each other for many years, especially concerning his pioneering work on the infrastructure of Japanese literature that was finally produced in the form of a book, Manufacturing Modern Japanese Literature, Publishing Prizes and the Ascription of Literary Value, from the very prestigious Duke University Press. In addition, he's the author of numerous articles on publication, and also, interestingly, that I didn't know about, that should be of interest to Mr. Del Greco over there, the Japanese Poetry of Yi-san, a collection of poems in the Columbia Anthology of Modern Korean Literature. So again, we're very much honored to have Professor Mack here. This talk is sponsored by the Institute for Japanese Studies, the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, East Asian Studies Center, Center for Latin American Studies, and the U.S. Department of Education Title VI grant. So without further ado.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me get the computer to wake up. Okay. Sorry, I don't know where the computer went. But let me begin. I was going to say let me begin by thanking a few people, and I will still do that. But let me instead begin by apologizing to all of you. I think you might find this talk a little esoteric. I will try. It's a fairly kind of academic talk, but I will try to inject. Okay, we just need to go back to the beginning. I'll try to inject some commentary. There we go. Some commentary that'll make it a little bit more comprehensible for those of you who are not in the field. But I can't be certain I'll be terribly successful at that. Don't let this talk turn you off the future talks. I know Michael Como in particular by reputation, and given that topic, it sounds like it's going to be fantastic. Oh, there you go. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. So thank you, Richard, for the invitation. I'm really pleased to come out here and meet you in person. Professor Torrance's work has been extremely inspirational to me over the years, and since 2005, he's actually been kind enough to work with me on some of my research, and I think the debt will be obvious when you hear the talk. So it's been a great pleasure, and it's a great pleasure to finally meet him in person. And also thank you to Janet, who's now photographing me, for all of the arrangements. She did a really brilliant job. And thank you all for coming this afternoon on such a gorgeous day. I look forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions at the end. Now, my talk today is on something that some of you may not have even known exists, but that is the Japanese language literature of pre-war Brazil. There's post-war Japanese language literary production in Brazil as well. I'm just limiting myself to try to keep the scope a little more manageable, but I can talk about that if there are any questions later. And I'll focus a little bit later on a literary competition that was held there in 1932. Little surprise to anyone familiar with my first book, I'll spend the majority of my time on the material history of the reading and writing community there before dallying briefly with three specific texts, the winners of this literary competition, before then turning to some questions of methodology, which I'll try not to make too obscure. Now, recent years have seen the impact of post-colonial studies on the field of modern Japanese literature. Obviously, post-colonial studies have had a tremendous impact on scholarship in a variety of fields. And the results in our field have been undeniably valuable. In English, scholars such as Leo Ching, Faye Kleeman, Bob Tierney, Kim Kono, and Karen Thornburg, not to mention Ozaki Hotsuki, Kawamura Minato, and Tarumi Chie in Japanese, have redirected our attention beyond the territorial borders of the post-war nation-state to the various spaces of Japanese imperial expansion. This redirection has occurred against the backdrop of a broader process of remembering Japanese imperialism, as the post-war notion of Japan as a mono-ethnic nation state within stable territorial boundaries, has been overwhelmed by a return of its repressed imperial past. This has led to the reemergence of texts that have been obscured, if you will, by the nation. The work of the scholars I mentioned a moment ago dramatically expanded the body of texts that we now examine under the rubric of modern Japanese literature, not to mention broadening the range of questions that the field now pursues. Today, I hope to continue this expansion of purview by discussing yet another reading community of Japanese language literary texts, this time not only outside of the territorial space of the nation-state of Japan, but also outside of the formal and semi-formal territories of the greater Japanese Empire. As is commonly known, large-scale immigration from Japan began in earnest after the legalization of emigration in 1884, when the Japanese government began encouraging and sometimes both supervising and sponsoring or subsidizing emigration to Hawaii, Australia, Fiji, the Caribbean, Canada, Mexico, Peru, New Zealand, and the United States. In the early years of the 20th century, however, the United States, Australia, and Canada all began to limit or forbid immigration from Japan. It's no coincidence then that, given the infamous Gentleman's Agreement of 1907-1908 in this country, that the first wave of immigrants to Brazil arrived in that country in 1908. When the Immigration Act of 1924, again the U.S. Immigration Act of 1924, explicitly denied entry to the United States to anyone who was ineligible for U.S. citizenship, the result was the near total termination of immigration from Japan. Following this development, Brazil became the primary destination of immigration outside of the Japanese Empire, and I'm including Manchukuo when I say the Japanese Empire. Statistics from 1930 show that the community in Brazil already represented a significant portion of the total number of Japanese abroad. At that time, by way of comparison, between 100 and 150,000 persons of Japanese descent lived in each of three destinations: Hawaii, the continental United States, and Brazil. Roughly 230,000 resided in Manchuria and Taiwan, respectively, and 500,000 were in Korea. Migration to Brazil peaked in 1933-34, with numbers declining steadily after that time, as the Vargas regime legislated in 1934 dramatically reduced immigration limits, and as Manchuria rose as the primary target of the Japanese Empire's immigration enterprises. Today, the population of individuals of Japanese descent in Brazil is still larger than that in the United States, with roughly 1.5 million persons in Brazil and 1.2 million in the United States, just to give you a sense of comparison. Now, the traditional image of the early migrants to Brazil accords with, and perhaps partially stems from, the image presented in the author Ishikawa Tatsuzo's work, Sobo, which was the recipient of the first Akutagawa Prize for Literature, which is one of the subjects in my first book. This work depicts rural peasants with few remaining options, escaping what they consider to be unsustainable living conditions in Japan. While this description was true of some, there was also a significant number of sojourners who actively pursued migration out of a desire to return to Japan, quote, wearing a golden brocade, nishiki o kite, after achieving wealth abroad, and emigres who went abroad looking to create utopian societies or to achieve alternate cosmopolitan identities. That homogenizing description of immigrants is insufficient should come as no surprise. What is perhaps more interesting is the suggestion made by the scholar Stuart Lone and others that this singular image of the hard-struggling and self-sacrificing peasant might be a self-romanticizing narrative embraced and developed partially by the immigrants themselves, perhaps in line with the way that Edward Said described exiled poets as, quote, lending dignity to a condition legislated to deny dignity. Leaving that claim aside for the time being, suffice to say that the individual migrants were motivated by a diverse constellation of preconceptions, exigencies, and desires. The migration of these individuals was enabled and often actively encouraged by state apparatuses in Japan and in Brazil. In the case of Japan, the motivations behind this state involvement included general economic interest, including the development of a trading partner and a source of raw materials, strategic interest, that is the development of its spheres of influence abroad, a sense of national pride domestically and its global prestige in the world system through what was called at that time in Japan peaceful expansionism, and domestic interest by addressing weakened rural economies and a perceived excess population, for example. Brazil, for its part, was primarily motivated by its need for labor for its coffee plantations. In the absence of a European source for laborers, after the Prenetti decree of 1902 had banned subsidized emigration to Brazil from Italy, Brazil was forced to set aside, or perhaps I should say redefine, the quote-unquote bleaching process advocated by some elites, and to reconsider its racial hierarchy. Amid this context, the Brazilian state began thinking of Japan, which in 1905 had just defeated a, quote, white nation in war, in the Russo-Japanese War, as sufficiently, I'm going to stop saying quote when I want to put words in scare quotes, because if I said it each and every time, it would be about half the talk. A lot of the issues I'm going to be talking about are issues of terminology, and I'm talking about contemporary belief structures. I'm not trying to give any credence to some of these belief structures, but Brazil began to see Japan as sufficiently, here the first set of quotes I'm going to leave out, civilized to be an acceptable source of immigrant labor. It is emblematic of the global forces that encouraged this migration that the crop the Japanese were initially brought in to work was coffee, one in a series of cash crop monocultural formations to which the majority of Brazilian agricultural production had been dedicated through its history as a formal colony of Portugal and an indirect economic colony of England. That is, the community of Japanese in Brazil came into existence largely because of a global economy based on first colonial and then neo-colonial economic asymmetry. Initially, contract migrants were sent to existing Brazilian fazendas, or plantations. Between 1908 and 1924, over 35,000 Japanese migrated to Brazil, where most worked as laborers on these coffee plantations. From the mid-1920s, however, the Japanese government had begun working to establish more independent communities for Japanese migrants. These projects took three forms: settlements formed by groups of individuals, communities established by private companies in the Amazon, and large blocks of state-owned land that had been granted to semi-governmental syndicates and were exempted from state taxes for a period of years. With their excellent facilities and significant financial incentives provided by the syndicate, this third type drew not only new migrants from Japan, but also Japanese immigrants already in Brazil. The result was large ethnic and linguistic enclaves. Although not all struggling peasants, we should note that the majority of the population remained involved in agricultural production in some way or other, and lived outside of the urban center of Sao Paulo City, often at significant distances. Sao Paulo, for those of you unfamiliar with the geography, if we look at the map as a whole, Sao Paulo is here. We're going to zoom in. Sao Paulo State, Sao Paulo City being here. I'm going to talk about the Bauru region, which is, Bauru is here. And each of the red circles represents communities of Japanese immigrants. The size of the circle shows us the size of the community that's located there. For a sense of distance, you have the scale on the side, and I believe it's in kilometers, so I believe the height, it's 250 kilometers is the full length of that scale. Okay. Despite the harsh conditions faced by nearly all migrants, demand soon appeared for print, newspapers, magazines, and books in Japanese. Data suggests, perhaps counterintuitively, that migrants possessed a reasonably high degree of literacy. And as Richard well knows, this is a total minefield what literacy is, but I'm going to kind of work around that issue. But to give us a sense of this, more than 70% of the immigrants possessed a primary school education, and a further 20% possessed a secondary school education as well. The very first readers obtained their books through one of four main avenues, common sense avenues. They brought them from Japan themselves, they borrowed them from friends, they ordered them directly from the publishers, or they purchased them through general stores, shoten or zakaya. Japanese language newspapers produced in Brazil appeared before the first decade was out. Though one launched in 1915 failed within a year, two newspapers launched soon after became the major newspapers of the pre-war period. The Nippaku Shimbun, which was started in early 1916, and the Brazilu Jiho, which was started in August 1917. These newspapers not only help us to reconstruct the market for literary text that soon developed, they themselves also become key sites of literary production. For the moment, however, let us consider consumption of texts from Japan. Advertisements for books appear in the domestic newspapers almost immediately. One of the earliest was for a general store named Keitel, located in the city of Sao Paulo, which advertised in February 19 that it handled books. Now, it's located in the city of Sao Paulo, but we know from a number of advertisements that they did a lot of their commerce through the mail. So its location in the main city does not necessarily mean that it's kind of dependent on walk-in traffic for these things. Needless to say, books were not Keito's main business. For those of you who can read Japanese, this is quite obvious. But I can mention to those who do not that what we see from this ad is that their business mainly revolved around carpenter tools, medicines, used sacks, and soy sauce. Soon after, however, one of the leading bookstores of the pre-war period, Endo Shoten, appeared. The entrepreneur Endo Tsunehachiro, shown here in a family photograph, was active in trading Japanese goods in Sao Paulo from at least as early as 1917. Under his own name, operating under his own name, he opened a store in 1920. At that time, he carried a variety of goods, including candy, medicine, and insecticide sprayers. I mean, you can tell from the goods that are for sale the nature of the lives that many of the people were living. Excuse me. He also lent books, as this advertisement shows. By 1924, he had renamed the company Endo Shoten. You can see on the far left. Though the company was advertising other goods, such as seeds, in 1927, by 1928 it was representing itself as Shoseki Senmon, specializing in printed matter or books. By 1932, Endo had changed the name of the company slightly but significantly from Shoten, general store, to Shoten, bookstore. Okay, I've lost my screen again, but at least it's here. Okay, so now we can see on the side, even as Endo Shoten celebrates its 10th anniversary, this is actually the first ad I found where it's not Shoten, it's Shoten. So there's a kind of irony there. But anyway, I won't go into that. And here's what the store looked like. I believe that this table and this table are the same table, so if you could kind of mentally put those images together, you might have a sense of what the store looked like. Sorry for the quality of the image. It's a photograph of a photograph taken as a photograph album was resting in my lap after a lunch at the son's house. Anyway, although likely the largest single bookseller in the pre-war, Endo Shoten was far from alone in the marketplace. As one example, here is a 1919 advertisement from a competitor, Segi Shoten. Shoten. Based on the hundreds of advertisements that appear between 1917 and 1941, Japanese language texts, and here I mean books, magazines, and newspapers, seem to have been highly sought after commodities in Brazil. One can imagine that migrants who were surrounded by a world that was so foreign may have turned to texts from Japan for that which was familiar, even if fictional. Thanks to the detailed catalogs of new stock that appeared in these advertisements, we have some sense of the specific books available during the first decades. Needless to say, this data must be considered only part of the story. Nonetheless, the ads suggest dramatically increasing availability as these mini catalogs grow from lists of as few as 15 titles to lists of nearly 400 titles, as seen in this ad from 1935. Now, this is a single entire sheet of the newspaper. It's a full-page ad. And each of these rows is actually a title of a work, a publisher, and a price. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns of that. Like I said, there are about 400 titles listed in this ad alone. This is not the full stock of the bookstore. This is just what has recently arrived. The data suggests that when consumers in Brazil bought books, they turned to authors who also enjoyed popularity in Japan, including, and this is based on my research of going through the titles that appeared in the advertisements I was able to collect. The authors that appear most frequently are Sasaki Kuni, an author that's almost disappeared from contemporary studies of Japanese literature, but who at the time was extremely popular. Tsurumi Yusuke, Kikuchi Kan, and Naoki Sanjugo. That's not to say that more unusual books did not appear as well, and I'm limiting myself to literary texts here. One example might be the work of the half-Russian, half-Japanese author Oizumi Kokuseki, which appeared as early as 1924. Though it's useful to know these books were available, the fact that we don't know the quantity available limits the value of the information. In fact, in many cases, I suspect there's only one copy of each of the books that are listed in the advertisement. We can speak with a little more authority about magazines, which were imported in bulk. Many periodicals from Japan were available from at least 1919, when Taiyo, Chuokoron, Waseda Bungaku, Shinshosetsu, Bunge Club, and other titles were advertised. Now, a single newspaper article from 1935, when the total number of migrants to Brazil from Japan had surpassed 170,000, gives us a glimpse into the magnitude of the Japanese language magazine market. According to this article, August 1935 was the first month in which more than 10,000 Japanese language magazines were imported into Brazil in a single month. The most commonly read magazine was, and this comes as no surprise to anyone who knows the pre-war publishing industry, was Kingu. This was the first Japanese magazine of circulation in excess of 1 million copies. And in the month of August 1935, 3,500 copies of this magazine were imported. The magazine that was the next largest in quantity during this month was Shufu no Tomo, one of the most popular women's magazines in Japan, with 1,200 copies. Now, for those of us who are interested in the Japanese literary canon, we think of magazines like Kaizo and Chuokoron, which were the two central, most important Sogozashi, general interest magazines, but also the most important literary magazines at the time. Only 80 copies of Kaizo and 70 copies of Chuokoron were imported into the country at this time. The last medium that we must consider is that of newspapers themselves. We know that a vast array of newspapers from throughout the Japanese Empire was available to consumers living in California in 1913. Similar arrangements were likely possible in Brazil. This advertisement from 1919, mentioned in conjunction with magazines here, suggests as much. Now, these newspapers would have only been available as subscriptions. There isn't some newsstand with newspapers from around the empire kind of lined up for walk-in sale. And so what's interesting here to me is not only that these texts from throughout the empire would have been available in Brazil, but it suggests that the local booksellers are working in conjunction with some of the large central distributors, such as Tokyodo, who would have been able to facilitate quite easily subscriptions to newspapers throughout the empire. As I discussed in my book, this sort of mediation of the circulation of text by print capital based in Tokyo was by no means unusual at the time. For publishers in Japan, these migrant communities presented a rich new market, an audience thought to have an insatiable desire for the cultural products of their home. Particularly from the 1930s, Tokyo-based publishing companies and Brazil-based retailers began significant newspaper advertising campaigns directed at these consumers. Advertising copy from these ads shows that publishers and booksellers soon recognized that they could better sell their products as solutions to a litany of fears they imagined were shared by many migrants. And these include fears of falling out of touch, of being insufficiently patriotic, of somehow being less than fully Japanese. Before long, the proportion of advertising space dedicated to publishing grew to mimic the situation in Japan itself, where pharmaceuticals and print were the two most advertised commodities. While these advertisements and articles verify that a plentiful supply of printed matter from Tokyo was available, it does not fully illuminate the size of the reading community. Some additional data does exist, however, that can help us in that effort. In 1939, an almanac produced by the publisher of the Nippaku Shimbun included a survey of reading habits of the approximately 11,500 households located in the Bauru region. I mentioned this earlier. You'll notice again the map of the state of Sao Paulo. You'll see Sao Paulo is the large black circle. These are the train lines. Now, this is a very large state, and the way you got around at the time was by train. And you can see the two lines heading up to the northwest. These are the two main train lines, and most of the immigrant communities would be established along, not surprisingly, along these train lines. So if we look at this map, and if you kind of keep this burned in your mind's eye for a moment, and I superimpose this, you can see the communities kind of going up along where we know the train lines were. So again, I'm talking about communities that are in the administrative district of Bauru. So we're not talking about Sao Paulo, we're talking about these out here. 11,500 households were surveyed from this area. Now, that would have meant that they were almost exclusively rural and engaged in some degree or other in agriculture. The survey found that of these 11,500 households, 9% purchased children's magazines, 17% purchased women's magazines, 52% purchased men's magazines, and a full 88% purchased newspapers. Now, I'm using the somewhat problematic categories that the survey itself used, but I think it gives us a rough idea. Significantly, the survey notes that it was very unusual for families to read newspapers from outside Brazil. So these papers from Japan and the Japanese Empire were available. But for the most part, these were not the newspapers people were reading. The vast majority read newspapers that were domestically produced, like Brazil Jiho, Nippaku Shimbun, the two papers I've been talking about. This fact indicates to us that if we wish to speculate on a readership for literary texts, it's important not to attend solely to texts imported from Japan. As in Japan, serialized fiction was pivotal for cultivating a regular readership. All of the major newspapers, and now I'm talking about the domestically produced newspapers, carried some form of literature. Brazil Jiho, in particular, dedicated a significant amount of space to imaginative writing. This included poetry, translations of Portuguese language literature into Japanese, and critical essays on literary activities in both Japan and Brazil. Now, today I'm going to focus on prose, but poetry was also a very significant presence in these newspapers and performed a somewhat different array of social functions, or at least I would so argue. In terms of prose fiction, many newspapers contained two distinct types of serialized stories. As I talk about these, you're going to wonder why I'm not using the terms popular literature and pure literature. I direct you to my first book for the reason why I'm not using those terms, but you'll notice they kind of correspond to our notion of that distinction. Now, the first type of literature, given pride of place on the front or back page of the newspaper, was works of historical fiction originally published in Japan. Now, later we find contemporary detective stories in this section, but for the first at least kind of 2 decades, it's almost exclusively historical fiction. The story was Kume no Heinai, which ended its run on January 28, 1921, after nearly 120 installments. That is more than 2 years of continuous appearances. Now, to give you a sense of this, this is the front page of the newspaper. Right? We're not leading with, Japan has gone to war. We're leading with what is Kume no Heinai up to now? How will he escape from the villain, or whatever it is? This was followed by Oishi Kuranosuke, a name that will be familiar to anyone who has read about the 47 Loyal Samurai. It started on February 4th, 1921, and proceeded to run for at least the next 4 years. Now, these were the first 2 of 6 historical works that ran for the first 14 years of the newspaper's existence. Though Oishi is the only one of these stories that I've been able to establish was serialized elsewhere prior to its appearance in the Brazil Jiho, they were all published in Japan in book form prior to their appearance in Brazil. For anyone interested in the creation of a sense of shared culture through the direct consumption of literary texts, these stories, I imagine, would be a good place to start, far better than what we think of as the elite canon of modern Japanese literature. The second type of fiction followed a very different formula and appeared in a different position in the newspaper on an inner page dedicated to literary activities. The realistic works that appeared on this page were exclusively about contemporary society and were only rarely from Japan. Most were written by local writers and set in Brazil. At least as early as 1922, in fact, the Brazil Jiho was actively soliciting short fiction, quote, whose material is based on the lives of doho in Brazil. Doho, meaning brethren, come from the kanji that mean the same uterus. It's an implication of a kind of blood, racial, filiative relationship. And it's soliciting this fiction from its own readers. Now, I'll return to that sort of work in a moment. This then is my best estimate of the material circumstances of Japanese language literary reading in Brazil prior to World War II. Books, magazines, and newspapers from Tokyo, and in limited quantity from throughout the Japanese Empire, were available and were purchased in sufficient number to maintain a growing marketplace for print. Multiple local newspapers existed containing both, quote, popular fiction from Japan and, quote, pure fiction, occasionally by authors in Japan. I'm talking about the case of the pure fiction, Ozaki Shiro, Hayashi Fusao, and others, but far more frequently by local authors. This was a state of affairs, in fact, that the newspapers actively encouraged, perhaps out of an interest in developing the community and its arts, but also out of a desire to attract subscribers and instill regular reading habits. The works were also cheap, but I won't talk about that right now. Motivations aside, not only did the newspapers frequently publish existing local writers, they even devised strategies to cultivate new ones, cultivate new local writers. Now, the most conspicuous example of this sort of cultivation was Brazil Jihosha's creation in 1932 of a Ashoka Min Bunga Tanpen Shousetsu competition, which the company announced in its pages as early as January of that year. 3 winners were announced, and you can see the winners here, first, second, and third place listed. Tobaku no Jidai was awarded first place, Aru Kaitakusha no Shi was awarded second, and Mihate no Yume was awarded third. Now, for the sake of time, my discussion of these texts as literary texts will be brief. The second and third place stories, Aru Kaitakusha no Shi and Mihate no Yume, which I guess I should translate, the death of a certain Kaitakusha pioneer, so the Aru Kaitakusha no Shi focuses on the character of Kaneko Daisuke, a diminutive man who through industry and economy has been able to achieve the colonial dream and become a well-off landowner and a leader in his local Japanese community. Having achieved his dreams of success, he now fantasizes about returning to his hometown, quote, wearing a golden brocade, the stereotyped goal of many of the immigrants I mentioned earlier. Having decided that the time has come for his triumphant return to Japan, he makes preparations and sets off on the journey home, only to be killed along the way by a Baiyan man, whom he had treated poorly earlier in the story. Now, we should note that referring to the man as Baiyan, that is from the Northeast, not just the state of Bahia, but probably the whole region, there's an implication that he's a dark-skinned man of African descent. That would be kind of coded into the language of the time. Now, Mihate no Yume is a more focused piece, limited in time and space to the arrival of a young picture bride named Shizuko to the port of Santos. This is the main port just outside of Sao Paulo where most of the immigrant ships landed. The story focuses on the despair that she experiences when she leaves the young, handsome, and kind Kunio. Note the name, Kuni for country, Kunio, whom she met aboard the ship, to meet the prematurely aged and unkempt Satoshi, whom she is to marry. The culture and refinement, the civilization of Kunio, whom she leaves at the port, much as she symbolically leaves her home of Japan at the port, is starkly contrasted by the labor-worn Satoshi, whose nicotine-stained, uneven teeth are physical manifestations of the uncivilized life that has produced him and to which she has unwittingly committed herself. And this is using language and attitudes from the story, not my own. Stylistically, the winning work, Tobaku no Jidai, or age of agricultural speculation, something like that. This work stands apart. The text is far more formally experimental than the other two works, resembling the roughly contemporary writings of the Shinkankakuha, the neo-perceptionists, more than it resembles the works just described. This is the story of a half-Japanese prostitute named Hanaoka Ruriko and a rich tomato farmer named Omura. In the course of the story, Ruriko prepares to abandon a young immigrant, also Japanese, with whom she has an ambiguous relationship, for a comfortable life with Omura. Omura, for his part, builds his wealth through the exploitation of his workers, most of all, or all of whom are also Japanese, and through the excessive use of chemical pesticides, which leaves the tomatoes beautiful, but, at least in the eyes of the workers, poisonous. In the end, Omura's fortune is purposely decimated by the trader Kurose, also Japanese, who holds a grudge against him. The concomitant damage to subsistence Japanese farmers barely warrants Kurose's attention, or the stories for that matter. We might note that the worlds depicted here are ones of despair. Dreams are shattered, trusts are betrayed, happiness is lost. One might think that this would indicate a pessimism about the process of immigration and the potential of establishing a lasting community in Brazil. At the same time, however, each of these stories possesses a mechanism by which these contradictions may have been resolved for readers, as each story implicitly posits an alternate settler-subject position that would either have escaped these fates or at least have remained an innocent victim of others' machinations. Kaneko is presented as stingy, prideful, and avaricious, presumably a similar individual who had responded to the pleas of the Bain would have been spared Kaneko's fate. Ruriko, Omura, and Kurose can all be seen as forms of corrupt humanity produced by the capitalist activities of the city. A working farmer would likely have read the story as an indirect celebration of his or her industry and virtue. Even Shizuko could be read as indulging in a form of vanity enabled by privilege, by which she unfairly disparages Satoshi for physical traits that are simply marks of his social class. Each of these stories could be read as an inverted paean to thrift, modesty, and physical labor. Since the topic of this talk is that which might be obscured by an excessive reliance on the nation as a heuristic, we should also notice the function of race in the stories. Although each of the stories recognizes the presence of visible heterogeneity of phenotypes, there's far less concern with relations between races than there is between what we might think of as the Japanese characters. There's little doubt in my mind that the authors of these stories would have subscribed to an uncritical notion of racial identity as being blood relations with their fellow countrymen. They are, after all, of the same womb, Toho. This is part of what makes the mixed blood character of Ruriko so threatening. At the same time, the stories are rife with betrayal of Japanese by Japanese. Arguably, it's the fundamental theme of each tale. Kurose betrays Omura, who in turn has systematically exploited his Japanese workers. Ruriko betrays her young lover in order to enter into a mutually exploitative relationship with Omura. Kaneko, who was tricked by a Japanese broker into buying undesirable land, now exploits his Japanese workers relentlessly, even as his children have disappointed him and abandoned him. Shizuko, for her part, was deceived by a Japanese marriage broker and now finds herself in a marriage with one man who may or may not have been party to that betrayal. Clearly, the ideology of race, ethnicity, the kokuminse, is present, but here we see it revealed again and again as an illusion, compromised for individual gain. For those of you familiar with Richard's work, you might find the situation here similar to the situations he describes in Izumo and Osaka, namely a local group of readers and writers who bear little relation to our dominant imaginary of participants in a monolithic project of modern Japanese literature. So-called popular literature seems to have a broad and committed readership and seems to emerge from kodan or storytelling circuits that likely owe more to Osaka than they do to Tokyo. So-called pure literature reading practices, by contrast, diverges almost totally from those implied by our conventional notion of literary canon. Instead, we find readers who recognize, to a certain extent, the power of the central bundan, the literary establishment, and who, again, to a certain extent, accept the claims of those writers of the central bundan to being something more than those of their pure local writers. At the same time, the works emerging from this central bundan do not possess hegemonic power here. In fact, the implicit claims of that hegemonic power are resisted, producing reactive effects more than exerting welcome influence. Rather, we see the dominant reading practices to be focused on this local writing. Now here's the first point of my talk. What this brings into relief is something that is clear to anyone, again, familiar with Richard's work and a few others, namely that the idea of a national literature is an extremely problematic one. This is visible here at a simple material level. The texts consumed are not the same texts one imagines in some abstract canon. Of course, we might say that this should not be a surprise, as the reading and writing practices did not occur within the sovereign territory of the nation state. The territorial state, however, is only one of the meanings applied by the ambiguous modifier Japanese. As Komori Yoichi and others have pointed out, this powerful and flexible term carries implications of a holy quadrinity: ethnos, state, language, and culture, each element of which is used in a circular definition of the other. The result is a persistent specter of the ethno-nation that is built into the very structure of our field. Now, the stories I've just discussed reveal deep suspicions about the legitimacy of the idea of an ethno-nation and the attendant notion of literary filiation of fiction written by people who are Japanese. In some ways, this is visible in the title of the competition itself, which called for Ashoka Min Bunga Tanpen Shosetsu, or colonial literary short stories. The primary filiation of text that is asserted here is not with the nation state, but instead with the shokuminchi, or in this case, colonia. In the explanation of the selection committee's choices, which accompanied the announcement of the winners, the newspaper stated that works involving life in the colony had been given priority. The committee, according to the article, looked for works that reflected an awareness that, quote, the circumstances of Japanese, or Nihonjin, society in Brazil today are completely different from those in Japan, end quote, and which were ones that could contribute to, quote, the literature that must be created by the society of our countrymen, Hojin, in Brazil, close quote. And this would be the Ashoka Min Bunga that they're talking about. Now, I've written about this at length elsewhere, and I won't go into great detail, but the term shokumin in Japanese emerges as a calque of the English term colony, which maintained a dual meaning present even in its Latin cognate. The situation was then further complicated by the specific valences of the Portuguese word colonia in Brazil, where in the state of Sao Paulo, it referred to the villages in which coffee plantation laborers, or colonos, lived during their contracts. So at an explicit level, when they say shokuminchi bunge, they're talking about a different thing than the shokuminchi of, for example, Korea or Taiwan. However, they were also, in a sense, talking about the same thing. Now, the 1932 award was actually part of a larger discourse on shokumin, or shokuminchi bungaku, which took place in Brazil from the mid-1920s into the 1930s. While not wanting to suggest that the opinions that appeared in that debate were unified, allow me to summarize points of agreement that appear in that debate. While a fundamental racial link is not questioned, identification with the contemporary polity of Japan and with the literature of the metropole is explicitly disavowed. A majority of the critics share scorn for what they believe to be the materialistic nature of their society in Brazil, yet they see literature as offering a solution to this problem. Sympathy for the proletarian literature movement is common, but so is the belief that such literature would be inappropriate to the Brazilian colonies, largely because of the fact that it was focused on agriculture rather than industry. A similar interest in what's known as nomin bungaku, or peasant literature, also arises as a result. The writers also seem to take great pride in a romanticized self-image based on grittiness, visible not just in the robust vigor of people who survive through hard physical labor, but also in the raw directness of their lifestyles. And this is the terminology and the language of the debate. Even as there are calls for spiritual development, there are also gestures to embrace the visceral side of colonial life as part of what makes it unique. I now understand why Alan had the reaction he did. Anyway, my point is not that these observations were accurate. Rather, I'm interested in the fact that the communal identity being asserted here is distinctly non-national, despite implicitly accepting a fundamental notion of biological filiation. And this is my second point. The framework proposed here by these critics and by this very literary competition not only implied that the local community in Brazil was the appropriate basis for textual affiliation, but also implied, partially because of the ambiguity of the terms shokumin and shokuminshi, that these texts might share affiliation with texts from other colonial spaces. It was clear to the participants in the debates described above that such a framework must differentiate the situation in Brazil from circumstances in the formal colonies of the Japanese Empire, the puppet state of Manchukuo, and even the semi-colonial spaces that existed in China at that time. This approach preserves a notion of material determinism behind textual affiliation, based in Taine's notion of race, milieu, and moment, but shifts the focus from an imagined shared environment of the nation to an imagined shared colonial socioeconomic condition. One can see the continuing usefulness of categorizing these texts as here imagined, within a framework that we might now theorize as, let's say, para-colonial, thus highlighting homologies and simultaneity with texts produced against the backdrop of formal imperial expansion. Such a framework would stress the way in which literary production exists within a global system premised on asymmetrical power structures that are a result of a history of imperial expansion and colonial subordination, and that continues to entangle historical peripheries and metropoles in complex relationships. This model could be applied to literary production both as a metaphor and as a concrete description of the marketplaces within which literary commodities circulate. Such a framework would stress the way in which some Japanese language literary production exists within an asymmetrical power relation that is partially a result of its relation to a history of imperial expansion, but is also a result of a contemporary world system that continues to render these peripheries variously defined as dependent to metropoles. The model of the global economy can be applied to, Adopting this alternate framework for grouping texts, however, runs the risk, and this is another one of my points, of reinforcing an imagined center despite all intentions to the contrary. To the extent that these texts might then be appropriated into a discourse of modern Japanese literature, I, as a professor of modern Japanese literature, implicitly start to appropriate these texts regardless of what discourse I assert for them. To the extent that these texts might then be appropriated into a discourse of modern Japanese literature, this expanded notion of Japaneseness might reinforce the ethno-nation state as an organic orthodox space of national plenitude, against which these spaces such as Brazil, are perceived as supplements, alternative, unorthodox, and ultimately incomplete in and of themselves. Rather than supplements, then, they would actually function as Derridian complements, completing the center to which they putatively contribute. It's only in the presence of pretenders that a claim of authenticity has any meaning, after all. Now, the criticism by Tomiyama Ichiro and others to Oguma Eiji's first book, The Myth of Japanese Homogeneity, is relevant here. Now, they noted how even his unconventional work with a clear kind of progressive agenda, nonetheless hypostatized fundamental organic ethnocultures. In so doing, the progressive arguments of multiculturalism indirectly reproduce reactionary nationalistic logics of ahistorical cultural identity. I believe this is the problem that has rendered Nihongo Bungaku, Japanese language literature, ineffective as a deconstructive move. To the extent that this new framework shifts focus to linguistic commonality, such a category is a valuable alternative. Such a framework strikes me as a far more logically coherent framework than that of national literature, in fact, but only to the extent that it replaces the framework of national literature. That is, so long as the works of both Ian Levy and Natsume Soseki become Nihongo Bungaku. Sadly, all too often, Nihongo Bungaku operates alongside Nihon Bungaku, designating a heterodox relationship between the text and a presumed national culture. Perhaps we should treat a national literature as a notional entity to which writers may aspire, or against which, as in the case of Brazil, they might rebel, just as the writers and critics described above. There's the rebellion aspect. Similarly, I wonder about the way in which institutions, be they in academia or in publishing, absorb texts into a notional national literature. One way this happens, of course, is when the nation insinuates itself into our research as a result of the institutional structure of Japanese studies. As Naoki Sakai has pointed out, when the national optic is internalized and becomes what he calls the propositional subject for our research, when what we study is modern Japanese literature, then the nation threatens to obscure these other potential optics. At the very least, I'm reminded to distinguish what I mean by Japanese. A shared language, a state apparatus, or a racial cultural imaginary, or perhaps something else. An ambiguous use of the term not only reinforces the fictive amalgam of culture, state, language, and race, but also shifts our attention away from historical readers and writers, thus allowing the nation to obscure the complex forces at play on any individual attempt to bridge the inevitable alterity between subjectivities through literary works. Now, I began this talk speaking favorably about the recent proliferation of work on literature in the colonies. While I do not wish to revoke these sentiments, I think it is worth noticing how even these expansions of the discourse on literary texts written in Japanese have had some potential reactionary repercussions. Even as these studies catalog dramatic heterogeneity in literary production, there is still a tendency for such scholarship to see these activities and the subject positions of the actors behind them as occurring in zones of contact between cultures, to which is imputed either implicitly or explicitly some degree of trans-historical self-identity, authenticity, or plenitude. I fear that the result is conflicted. Even as the studies describe the shifting borders of Japan through history, they sometimes reinforce highly problematic claims to ethnic organicism. Rather than attempting to lay out an alternative prescriptive heuristic model for the notion of Japan or Japanese literature that we associate with it, it might be more valuable to remain in a position of criticality and uncertainty, cognizant of the way in which many of our academic environments might encourage innovation in epistemological frameworks, even as those innovations are appropriated by existing biases to reinforce a core notion of an ethno-nation instantiated as legitimate autochthonous subjects of the nation-state of Japan. We cannot imagine that the meaning of Japanese in the formulation modern Japanese literature is self-evident, or that any attempt to define it could be done so without altering our notion of the text through such an assertion of filiation. In simpler terms, and with this I'll close, I believe that we need to recognize both the historicity and the power of a notion such as Japan, and to treat it not as an ontological, ahistorical reality, but as a heuristic problem. Rather than trying to link texts to define Japan, or to use a notion of Japan to interpret texts, we must focus on the ways in which the flexible signifier in Japan not only has functioned in the lives of historical authors and readers, but also continues to function in our lives as contemporary scholars and students situated in an institutional matrix. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk.
Please.
Toward the end, you did mention ethno-nation. Were you referring to Mizogu? Because I thought rather than look at it, you did not mention the word.
Yeah. So to me, and it's quite interesting, the use of the term nation, as many people have pointed out. I like to preserve the kind of, what I believe is a little bit more rigorous definitions of nation really being an imagined kind of biological community of individuals that is then instantiated as an actual government and a territory when it becomes a nation state. When there's a state that claims its legitimacy as being seen as the self-determined governance of a people by those people. Now, of course, you have issues. I mean, of course, it's more complicated than that. You get an issue like the United States, where in fact it's not a biological affiliation that's claimed, but a kind of ideological affiliation that's claimed. But fortunately, when you're studying Japan, I really think that we rely to a surprising degree on a very unreflective notion of race underlying things. So when I say nation, what I mean is something like a kokumin that is presumed to be based on a minzoku, say, and then becomes, when it becomes a modern state in the Meiji period, becomes a kokumin kokka. That's how I'm thinking of it.
Okay. The business about nation is fascinating in this context, in part because this is not Japan. It's sort of, in a way, I guess, not. At what point could we come to this alternative, just can be fully subject to Brazilian law, or maybe they were from the start.
You know, I don't know what the policy is with regard to Issei. I ought to know. Nisei, of course, are full citizens. You know, it's a law of land versus law of blood citizenship arrangement. I don't know about first-generation people naturalizing. I'm sure it's possible. I don't know what the procedure is or what the barriers are to doing it. But what I would like to take issue with, and this is very speculative and it's very theoretical, I don't want to deny the centrality of the nation state either to actual concrete realities in the present day. You know, there are people who kind of want to imagine a post-national kind of cosmopolitan identity, which is really only available to people of a certain economic class who are part of certain privileged ethnicities, who are traveling through certain spaces, right? And most people are still very much enmeshed in a world of nation states. So I don't want to deny the concrete reality, nor do I want to deny the centrality of a national imaginary to people's daily lives today. But what I want to do, though, is historicize the nation state as one imaginary of collective political agency that has been extremely powerful, but I want to avoid the Francis Fukuyama end of history trap, where we kind of say, like, oh, thank God we've reached the nation state. Now this was really where we were all headed. We finally figured out where everybody's meant to be, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this, like the Colonial Studies, while they're understandably critical of imperialism, there's this kind of, to me, there's this implication that just if the Koreans went back to Korea and the Japanese went back to Japan, everything would be fine. Like, right, if everybody could just get back to their spaces where they're meant to be, everything would be fine. I understand why they do what they do. In this historical moment, anything that isn't just explicitly and consistently critical of imperialism threatens to become an apology for imperialism. Using the Brazil thing, I get to have a little more distance from that particular political issue. And so what I want to leave open a space for a future form of collective political agency that isn't necessarily based on a claim of ethnic solidarity. So a Japan, for example, that maybe doesn't follow the same territorial boundaries, or that allows people who aren't ethnically Japanese to claim a position in that collective political agency that's not a supplement. That's not like, oh, we are going to let them vote too. I want to imagine, I want to leave open an epistemological space for the construction of these alternate political agencies, even though I don't know what form they're going to take. If I could, I wouldn't be teaching Japanese literature. I'd be going to politics or something. But I want to do my small. I mean, I do think. Again, I don't want to overstate what happens when we teach Japanese literature, but I do think there's a very, despite I think the best intentions of most of us in the field, I think we find ourselves constantly reinforcing a notion that historically has been very powerful and good. Like, that is to say, the nation-state imaginary has not been uniformly bad. I mean, we look at Frantz Fanon talking about it, for example. The nation is an necessary, extraordinarily valuable formation. But like Fanon pointed out, this is great. Boot out the imperialists, but the day the imperialists leave, we're going to have problems, because this is, in a sense, a strategic notion that, and it's been a valuable strategic notion. I don't want us kind of constantly reinforcing its naturalness or self-evident status unknowingly.
Great.
So.
I want to ask about the state of those Japanese newspapers and the other Japanese publishing during the war itself.
Yeah, declared illegal languages, they are shut down. That's that.
Was there any sort of, were the Japanese in Brazil
enemy languages, sorry.
National security, so to speak?
Say it one more time.
Were the Japanese were in Brazil considered a threat to national security? And of course, thinking of what happened in the U.S.
So now, while I try to know as much about the historical circumstances as possible, I should begin by saying that I'm not a historian of modern Brazil or of Japanese in Brazil. But my understanding of the situation, there are no internment camps, as there are in the United States. However, there were, I don't know if this was only Peru, it might have also happened in Brazil, there were a small number of very unsavory swaps where Japanese South Americans were sent to American internment camps in exchange for, I don't remember, anyway, so that it's not that it was zero, it was not things were wonderful, but people, and Brazil did side with the Allies. They were, there was a assertion that Japan was an enemy nation. There was concern in the legislature about the loyalty of Japanese in Brazil, et cetera, but it never reached the pitch that we saw in the United States or the tragedies that we saw in the United States. I was talking to Richard, it's a great pleasure to study it because the archives are far better preserved from the pre-war than they are in the United States because there weren't, the materials while being declared an enemy, a language of an enemy nation weren't, sought. Well, they were sought out. For example, Endo, who I mentioned, his family, when they had to shut down their bookstore when Brazil took sides, and they initially kind of secreted away their stock in a storage room and then eventually had to turn it over. So a lot of materials were seized. But at first they could just store it in their warehouse. It wasn't that systematic. It wasn't as intense as in the United States. And things start up again after World War II. There's some specific problems that happened in Brazil. I don't know if people know about the kachigumi, makegumi phenomenon in Japan, where there was it's a fascinating story. I probably shouldn't launch into it. But there was even after, when the war ended, there was this big debate over who had won the war. And the Japanese community split into two groups. I don't know if the numbers were literally half and half, but one group felt that Japan had won. That everyone knows the photograph of MacArthur towering over the emperor, right? If you'll remember, MacArthur's in these kind of drab, beige, I don't know, I'm not a military person, what do you call that? Kind of almost like an everyday uniform. Certainly not a dress uniform. And of course the emperor's in his kind of a full Western regalia. And a lot of people looked at it and said, look, MacArthur's clearly a prisoner of war. Like this photograph proves that Japan won.
There's a subject of a novel, right?
Solbo doesn't deal with that, but there was a recent bestseller in Portuguese about this called Dirty Hearts, I think is the way you might translate it. It's a well-known kind of event. I'm sure there's a novel about it. I don't know if Solbo doesn't deal with this.
Yeah, Takeda Taijun wrote about it, right? Takeda Taijun?
Yes.
Yeah, and it results in murder.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I'll have to, please later tell me more about that. So anyway, it's a really fascinating thing. But then there was also a second wave of migration to Brazil in the post-war between the mid-50s and the early 60s, before the Japanese economic recovery really started to take off. About another 40-some-odd thousand Japanese migrated to Brazil. And then it's now, after that, as the Japanese economy boomed, it dropped to almost nothing. And the literary stuff starts up then, when the newspapers are resumed a few years after the end of the war. But in a kind of different form, anyway. Yeah, Richard, please.
I know that studying the internal reports of the censors in Japan, one thing that they really were afraid of were Japanese language newspapers from abroad, from Seattle or San Francisco, right? They were really afraid of that. And does the same thing happen in Brazil?
Oh, I've got a great anecdote.
From this early period, do you kind of get Japanese discrimination against Brazilian-born people, Japanese ethnicity?
Great, thank you. Two wonderful questions, and I'll deal with them as kind of separate things if that's okay. So the first one, again, if you're studying under Richard, for those of you in the room, you know that the way censorship functioned in Japan is fascinating and wasn't a simple mechanism. Everything from writers self-censoring because they knew they wouldn't get their works published, to journals self-censoring because they didn't want their magazines to take the financial losses of being shut down, to pre-publication censorship by the state, to post-publication censorship and seizure by the state. Anyway, there were all the different stages. But what we also know, because of work by people like Shimamura Teru and other people, is that you get these perverse situations where, we all know Kinokuniya, this situation where Kinokuniya's posted opening hours. Kinokuniya started out as like a left-wing bookstore, right? So posted opening hours were 10 a.m., but everybody knew to show up at 9 because the guys that would set up tables out front, sell the stuff that they knew at 10 the police were going to show up to confiscate. So people would form lines and they'd sell out the whole thing. And when the police came, they'd be like, oh, here are the leftover copies. So, recent work was talking about Ikiteru Heitai and saying, oh, this was banned in Japan, so no one ever read it in Japan until after the post-war. Well, I don't know so much about that specific case, but I really doubt that's true. That it was banned and that copies were seized, I have no doubt of. But that doesn't mean that the books didn't circulate widely. Now, the way it relates to your question is that for post-printing censorship, some of those books got on boats before they were seized. And so you get very perverse things. I don't remember if I saw this ad. I have it in my research notes in Brazil or in California. I think it was Brazil. An ad in the Japanese language newspaper about a book that says, banned in Japan, come and read it and see what all the stuff is about. The fact that it was banned becomes the advertising slogan, right? Because the Japanese state can't enforce any censorship once it's there. And so they were actually using it as advertising copy. This is an illegal book in Japan. Come buy it at our store. You'll find it in the front window display, right? So there's that. It's really quite fascinating.
The other way, newspapers, the native newspapers done in Brazil.
Coming back in.
Coming back.
Yeah.
That's what the authorities were really afraid of.
I haven't looked for newspapers coming back in, and maybe later you could tell me about ways I might do that. Literary texts from Brazil, there's almost no reverse flow. There's almost nothing. Ishikawa Tatsu's Sobo appeared, of course, in Japan. But, Ishikawa went there for 3 months and then came back, maybe 6 months. And it certainly wasn't longer than 6 months. And then came back and wrote this novel. So I don't even think he physically wrote it in Brazil. He wrote it in Japan. I'm currently looking at a story that's considered to be perhaps the best literary work from the pre-war in Brazil. And even though it appeared in 1937 in Brazil, in 1951, I believe, it was reprinted in Bungeishito, or at least apparently it was. I've sent my request to the Kindai Nihon Bungakan and the Kokai Toshokan for copies, and we'll see how long I have to wait for that. I haven't seen it with my own eyes, but apparently that story was reprinted in a metropolitan journal. But other than that,
but I wonder why the censors were so sensitive about it, because you have those monthly reports that are being distributed to the prefectures from the census. Every one of them says, if you manage to see these foreign-made newspapers that are not being censored by us, be aware of them and so on and so forth.
Right. Well, here's
Who knows?
what you see, here's one of the things. If we think about the space occupied by the territory of the state of Japan, the space occupied by the ethnicity, the space in which the language is used, if we think of those as all coterminous, then we can't understand this problem at all. But of course, that's an entirely fantastical notion. And what we have here are the fact that these are not coterminous creating this very situation. So what I'm wondering, the censors, cutouts are not something the censors can look for, but we imagine it would be trivially easy for, because Brazil Jiho was an establishment newspaper, but Nippaku Shimbun wasn't. In fact, the guy got in a lot of trouble for writing very critical stuff, the editor, for publishing a lot of critical stuff. What would it take for a family to cut out an article that could never have been published in Japan, put it in the Post, and just mail it to family members who then circulate it? Because it's complete, it's in Japanese, right? We could debate how clean the borders of the language are. But at a functional level, it was completely understandable, and yet not constrained by the same laws. So it's a fascinating situation, but unfortunately, I don't know how to explore that.
You seem to suggest in your talk that there is a sense of more solidarity to the colonized population, within the colonized population, than there is within the colonized population for Japan, right? That's what you seem to suggest. Does that hold, do you think that holds true in the case of, would you suggest as well in the case of Taiwan, Manchuria, or is it a matter of time?
So if I can, let me step back and make a kind of methodological comment that I also is something that really bothers me about some recent developments in the field. Japanese literary studies has seen over the past, say, 20 years a real move towards cultural studies, where it's not sufficient for the scholars working on Japanese literature to tell us something about literature. They need to tell us something about something bigger, Japanese imperialism or whatever it is, race dynamics, and whatever it is. I understand that desire, and I actually share the desire to have a greater relevance to talk about larger issues. I just think it's extremely methodologically problematic to look at a few literary texts and then draw conclusions about a community, et cetera, et cetera. So to clarify, what I'm saying is that these few critics were imagining a literature where the bonds of filiation among texts in the community and the perspective of the authors ought to be more focused on the community than about the nation state.
Whether that, yep. You were saying that in terms of that prize they offered,
right? Immediately
they say no, we're going to give priority to our regions,
yes,
our
yes,
people,
exactly,
to our readership, basically.
Right.
And so that would seem to emphasize local concerns
yes.
as opposed to national concerns.
Absolutely.
So I'm just wondering if the same thing is might obtain in Taiwan,
yeah.
Seattle, in
right. And because that's happening in the establishment newspaper, we imagine that's not a fringe perspective. Mm-hmm. However, and this is kind of what little historical training I received because I was a history major as an undergrad, I'm cautious about then saying, therefore, we can draw the conclusion that the broader community shared this attitude. But I think it's very suggestive that they probably did, that there was much more of an issue of local solidarity and a kind of sense of belonging to the local community, even as defined in contrast to the national community. Now, do we see this in other spaces? I understand the desire and can see the value in trying to generalize. But when I think about something like Liu Qing's work, which doesn't fall into the, I love Liu Qing's book, and I don't think it falls into most of the traps I've described. But, the way he talks about Taiwan, for example, it doesn't make sense because of the specific dynamics in Taiwan about, do you identify with a continental Chinese population? Do you identify with an indigenous Taiwanese population? Anyway, very specific dynamics there that I think if you just did it, I don't know if you can just do local community versus metropolitan community. I think that the dynamics are more complicated there. Korea, the level of at least bureaucratic assimilation of Korea into the empire is always shocking to me. And so then that creates a very different dynamic. And then as we talked about over lunch, Manchuria, of course, has this multi-ethnic situation that makes it complicated. So not only am I not qualified in the particulars to make that generalization, I'd even be, I'd be a little bit kind of theoretically nervous about it.
And as to just early on, this discrimination against people.
Oh, right. Sorry, that was your second question. Okay. Oh, this is a great topic, and I can't claim that these are my ideas. A scholar, Tsume Kang, has done some very interesting work on this. His name is, his family name is Nishi, the Nantoka Hiko. Sorry, it's very embarrassing. Oh, this is going to go on YouTube. Great. Okay, anyway, my apologies, Nishi Sensei. I can't remember his first name entirely off the top of my head. Anyway, has wrote a great article. There's a term in Portuguese called caboclo, which it's a mixture of I'm sure it's had slight variances in its usage over time, but it's about peoples who at least have a portion of their blood is indigenous to South America. And he writes and this word goes into the kabokuro, it goes into the Japanese local dialect very quickly. In Brazil, not in Japan. Not that I know of in Japan. And he makes the argument, Nishi Masahiko, I think. Anyway, he makes the argument that this is a particularly touchy issue for Japanese, partly because, the Meiji period was all about building making Japan into a civilized nation in a kind of Spencerian linear notion of a kind of modernization narrative. And here they were having kind of hard won this status as a civilized nation. They go to Brazil, and a lot of these people find themselves in the economic situation that we now kind of see as quite common throughout the global South, of recognizing that they are in colonial or kind of neo-colonial relations to the first world. I'm using terminology from various discourses, but to the first world. And recognizing also that they're in a very tricky racial situation in Brazil at this time. I talked about the bleaching process. There's this desire in Brazil to make the population as white as possible. And they're recognizing that in Brazil, like in so many other countries, Asians hold this kind of tenuous, like in South Africa, honorary white. They are perceived as maybe not quite white, but like pretty good in this kind of crazy racial hierarchy. And so there's there's terror about mixing, what is the word, hypodescent, introducing lesser blood, right? Like tainting these bloodlines. And
the Japanese community in Brazil.
It's a fear that we see broadly. And so this notion of kabokuro becomes symbolic of a fear of mixing with ethnic groups that would pull them back from this hard-fought kind of status as a civilized nation. So we basically, I think Nishi's point, having not read his article recently, I have to look back at it, but is that these Japanese arrive in Brazil with very fraught notions of racial hierarchy and their position in racial hierarchy, and then enter a space in which you have another fraught racial discourse that functions in a slightly different way. The economy of kind of racial notions is slightly different, and so they're trying to fit these together, and so kabokuro becomes a notion in which fears that come from the racial discourse in Japan meet with fears that are already present in a Brazilian racial discourse, and it becomes a very fraught notion. So people are, the short answer is yes, people are very concerned about this.
But then, when they return from Brazil to Japan, then do they encounter discrimination, like in the post-war period, or more recently, right, where you had a large influx of Brazilian
with de Kasegi and that sort of thing.
Right, but they, certain families live in Brazil for generations.
Yeah.
And their youngest, during the economic boom, they go back to Japan for money, because they can make a lot of money in Japan. And then there's this kind of discrimination against that. Does that have antecedents before the war as well? Or is there not that much going back and forth?
There certainly isn't a lot of going back. It's a 50-day ride by boat, and it's very expensive. You certainly don't have people bouncing back and forth. You do have people going from time to time. The Endo family that I mentioned, the bookstore owners, I think the sons went over for part of their education. Sending kids back for a part of their education was not an uncommon thing. how they were treated. I mean, the thing is, at that point, the population is fairly young. So an Issei that's been in Brazil for, say, 8 or 10 years comes back to Japan, and in that sense, all they've been is a sojourner. So there's no real reason for there to be discrimination. It's with the second generation, the people born in Brazil who maybe don't speak Japanese as well, and what they confront. And second generation people returning to Japan is a phenomenon that's probably not entirely limited to the post-war, but it's probably predominantly a post-war phenomenon. And I know, and again, I can only speak anecdotally because this is out of my area of specialization, but it's well known that the Nipo Brasileiro, the Japanese-Brazilian identity, tends to have a Japanese component that's very stressed for individuals. A lot of these people could be third generation, they don't know any Japanese, they're totally in Sao Paulo, and they still go into their local bar, and the bartender's nickname for him will be Japonés, like Japanese, hey, Japanese guy. Like, it's not really, anyway, and I've asked people, like, aren't you just terribly offended by that? And they're like, why would I be? Anyway, the point is, the way, not that it's like, oh, it's a kind of totally peaceful, functional, multiracial society, but simply that it works differently from what we might expect from the United States. Anyway, so it's people, I think, spend their lives being told that they are Japanese in Brazil. And then when they come back to Japan, I imagine at some level, there's an expectation that maybe like, oh, finally I will be among my own people. And of course, almost immediately realize that that's not the case. And they're not treated as Japanese. They're treated as Japanese Brazilian. They're treated as Nikkei. They're treated as, and there are class issues involved here. And again, speaking anecdotally, a lot of the people I've known have come with great expectations about their time in Japan, only to leave really disliking the country. But that's totally anecdotal. But it's yes, so you, especially being born abroad, you don't just re-enter Japanese society as Japanese, that's for certain.
Thank you very much for the fascinating.
I'd like to thank the 9 of you for staying. Thank you.